Hi, Sally. Thank you so much for joining me with Confidence Conversations. How are you today?
I'm doing really well today, Jocelyn, and thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Of course. And as you know, we start every confidence conversations with the question, what does confidence mean to you?
Mm. Yeah, it's such a great question, too. For me, I see true confidence as being kind of the intersection of clarity, alignment, and practice meaning like consistent action for something. So I see it as really an internal ease,
Mhm.
like one that's really grounded in self-awareness and self-acceptance, and the most important part, self-acknowledgement, right? All those natural strengths. So I think for me, confidence, I think so many times we think of it as being external, but I see it as really internal. It's not something we put on. And it's not something we have or don't have, right? It's what we naturally develop when we know who we are and what matters to us and our why, and we just keep showing up for that. So to me, that when I see that in somebody or when I feel that myself, that's confidence.
Yeah, I like the notion that you just mentioned, which is knowing our why. But then sometimes there's a gap between, knowing your why and then actually executing on that why. And as a transformational life coach and the founder of Whole Life Strategies, one of the things that you mentioned when we spoke before was actually before we can think about what's next or what we're going to do, we have to take a second to really consider where we are, who we are, and where we've come from. So, from your perspective, what is the power of reflection?
I think reflection is key to everything, right? It's especially in the world that we're in right now, where everything is constantly changing. It's really fast paced, and there's not often in our daily lives that pause. So
Mhm.
for me, I call it reconnection in my work and in my book. And it's really for me about when we're thinking about what's next, we need to know how we got there, where we are now. We need to know where we are. And then that opens up more possibilities for where we might be going.
Mhm.
But the other piece of it is like, what did we learn on the way to get there? Right. Like,
So,
and
how do we,
without taking that reflection, it's hard to know what we've learned on the way. Right?
yeah, I think reflection is key, but I want to hear from you what does that process look like? What is the process of reflection to really get an understanding of that? Because I think it's one thing to say it, but how do we actually do that work?
Yeah. And that I think is there's a couple of key factors to that work. I think part of it is individual, but for me, the biggest piece is like actually setting that time, that pause. It's very powerful to just take that time to take stock, right? And so then we start looking at those things like, where am I right now? Where do I think I want to go? What are my values? What's important to me? What is that why? Right. And just really taking time to do that reflection, whether it's a journal, whether it's working with a coach, whether it's just scheduling time once a week or once a day to kind of just step back and do that work. So there's ways to do it informally and there's ways to do it formally. But I think what is powerful about it is that it is the foundation that makes all of what we want to do next more sustainable.
Mhm. Yeah, I like that you really reiterated the pause because so often, especially for the listeners of this podcast, we are women on the go. We're doing a million different things. And so
Yes.
we're really good at executing, but it's in that moment, that piece, that pause, that period of reflection where we're actually able to stop and do some real thinking. In other instances, I think a lot of times we're really just responding to the world around us, responding to the things that we have to do. But in taking that time, we're actually able to align and go within. And I know that a part of your work also is actually helping people tap into revitalization, getting right into the pause and self-care before diving into, all right, what are their goals and pushing outward. So why do you feel that it's so critical, this step in particular? And what
Mhm.
is the role of self-care in general well-being?
I think you explained it so well, right? It can be so easy to be in it and to be, especially when we have big goals, like to jump into those goals and push them forward, right? And we give our goals so much power. So it's really twofold. I think that self-care and well-being piece, change taps our resources, right? Moving towards big goals taps our resources. So we need that revitalization just to fill the tank and to be able to keep moving forward in a way that is sustainable for us and is really effective for us, right? I mean, we can't be effective when we're depleted. And so that's one piece of it. But I think the other piece is that in order to do the work that we want to do, we need to have that foundation and that personal energy that's managed. I like to use the word nourishment versus self-care a little bit, because I think self-care, it gets a bad rap because it's been so commoditized and commercialized in some ways. And we start to think of it as like, we need to give ourselves a bunch of treats because we're getting on the edge of burnout. So self-care is like filling up that stuff. And it's really so much more meaningful and so much more a critical piece of our overall well-being, right? And for me, why I'm passionate about that is it's also research-based, right? There's plenty of research out there that shows we need that. And it's very easy to get caught up in our culture of being busy and convince ourselves we don't need it, or we can do it later, or it's not that important, when it's actually very critical to our overall well-being.
It's everything. And I think especially when we do have those larger goals, but I guess what's the balance then? How do we balance, that sense of nourishment with what we know we have to do, we have to execute, we have these huge long to-do lists. So what do you say in terms of being able to balance and juggle all of those priorities?
For me, I say that make it non-negotiable.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a hard part, I think, for a lot of women, because it's easier to be externally focused on all the things and all the responsibilities and the commitments and the caring that we have going on externally. So it's really carving out that time. And I hear from a lot of women in my coaching practice, and even friends and family and colleagues, is that, I don't have time for self-care. And I really push back on that, because it can be 2 minutes. Right? I mean, taking even 2 minutes out of your day to just be, what do I need right now? And giving yourself that. So there's that kind of like, kind of in the moment kind of self-care that we can continually be doing. But there's also, creating some foundational practices. And I really advocate keeping it simple. Right? We don't need to be doing all the things. We don't need the 20-point self-care routine, because we've got enough on our to-do list. Self-care shouldn't be a job. We have enough jobs. But what it can be is like picking a couple of foundational practices. And I like to do one. In my book, I talk about creating balance in your self-care by just picking one thing you do for your mind, for your body, for your spirit, and one thing you do to create a supportive environment around you, whatever that looks like, right? And if you can just do those 4 things every week, you've got a really good foundation that you can build on.
I love that. And what, may I ask, is your one thing?
My personally one thing is, for me, morning meditation. I know a lot of people, meditation is it's not everybody's thing, but I've been meditating since I was 19 years old. And for me, a morning that I don't spend 15 minutes meditating, I'm a little bit off kilter. So for me, that's very much a grounding space, and it looks different all the time. I experiment with different practices, but that's a one thing for me. The other one thing for me is, for my body, I need to move every day. Mm-hmm. And I might not be working out every day. I don't these days, but I do move every day.
Yeah, I think that movement is so important, and just because it helps us shift our energy, especially in the day and age where we're working from home so often. Sometimes for me, I do Pilates quite a bit throughout the week, but when I'm not doing that, just a walk around the block between meetings. So it could be something, like you said, that's really small in the moment, asking yourself, what do I need? And so while I could be, catching up on emails during that like 15-30 minute break, maybe my brain needs to use that time for a break. And so one of the other things I've been very intentional about is scheduling, 15 to 30 minutes throughout the day where it's possible, and not assigning anything particular for self-care during that time, but just leaving it open, but like building that self-care time in so that I can like debrief, because it also enhances your ability to function, to think, and to be able to thrive at whatever it is that you're doing. And I know that thriving for you is really important because you actually work at the intersection of career and life coaching. And you've built a framework that intrinsically links the two. So can you tell me a bit about the work that you do to help your clients on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. And I just want to say, I love what you just said about the just carving out that time and not having anything on the plate, like that white space. The other thing that it really does is it builds that muscle of self-trust and self-awareness about what you need, right? So you get to make that decision every day. It really kind of builds those neural pathways. And talking about like confidence, that self-awareness and that self-acknowledgement about what you need just builds confidence as well.
And also the self-trust, right? That I can still get all of the things done.
Yes.
Take a break.
Yes.
Because I think we think often, like before we start engaging in these practices, like I can't do that. I have too much to do. But try it out.
Exactly. Exactly. This is what I say, like experiment. And if it doesn't work for you, you can stop and experiment with something else. But it's just an explorer mission, right? To find out what's going to work for you. And that is, to your question, a big part of my sustainable success framework is I started out working with this, particularly just in reinvention, but I have found that it goes across the board of all the coaching that I do, whether it's career development or whether somebody's just, redesigning pieces of their daily routine, or they're doing a big kind of transition, that it's that marrying of life and career that reminds us that we don't live professional lives over here and personal lives over here and have to try to balance the two, right? We live one life with a bunch of responsibilities. And what we want to do is be able to integrate that. It's already integrated. We just need to show up looking at it that way, and that makes it a lot easier. So for me, the model is really about that reconnection is the first piece of it. And it's that pause to step back, really looking at your and building your foundations of what are your values and what are your strengths, what are your experiences, what's important to you right now, all of those pieces, and getting that, getting some clarity around that. Because then you move into the next piece, which is more about the vision. And there's a lot of research that shows if we have a bigger picture vision, it makes all the day-to-day stuff a lot easier to do and the goals a lot easier to accomplish. So I get into the real, like, what's the possibility? Yeah. And then that revitalization piece, because change is challenging and change requires our inner resources. It doesn't need to be hard, but it does challenge our inner resources and it taps pieces of us. So having some sort of plan for revitalizing yourself through the process and looking at how that's working. And then you get into like the nuts and bolts of the redesigning the plan, testing and trying some things. At the end, you're in that restructure piece where you're in the next chapter, things are different, and you're putting it all together. So it's very much a holistic framework that not only blends life and career, but it also blends foundational pieces with the action pieces, right? Because we can't be in theory and we can't be in action. We need to marry them together.
That is very well said, because I think sometimes we get into these phases, appropriately so, where we're focused on like mapping out what it is that we want and doing our vision boards and thinking in theory what life could be. But then there's also the balance of like, all right, especially when we, the word that you hear all the time these days is manifestation. In order to manifest anything into your life, you also have to have that action piece, but keeping that vision very much top of mind, especially as you mentioned, we're always wearing these different hats. We have so many things that we have to juggle. And there's these labels that are assigned to us, whether it's mom or student or teacher or daughter or caretaker, whatever those labels are. And we all wear like at least 4 or 5 of them.
Yes.
How do we have a vision for like even that one hat that we're wearing? And how does that label or that vision for that area of our life fit into the greater whole? So how do we we navigate all of those different sectors without losing sight of the overall plan or vision that we have for ourselves.
Yeah, I think part of it is taking the time to have that bigger picture vision and answering those questions. Like, how do we want those things to fit together? Because I think that's the other piece. Not only do we have all the labels, we have all the expectations coming at us from all those labels. Right? So it's sort of stepping back and taking ownership of, well, how do I want those things to work together? What's my version of success in this situation? And then keeping that at the forefront as you're making decisions, that can be really powerful, because it's very easy to get caught up in, we're supposed to juggle all the things perfectly. And in reality, nobody does that. Like, that's not how life works, right?
Not only does no one juggle everything perfectly, but even if perfection is possible, which it's not, perfect in my mind is so different from perfect for you versus perfect for anyone else. And so just not even comparing that, and then taking ownership of the fact, and like the huge blessing that is the fact that life is and can be whatever we want for it to be. And so the vision that we create doesn't have to look like, sound like, or feel like anything we've ever heard before. We can create that ourselves. And I think that when we really own that responsibility of like, we are the co-creators of our life as it is, the history that we've created as a function of our thoughts and the visions that we've laid forth and that we can change right now, I think gives us a lot of power.
Yes, it gives us tremendous power. And it can be confronting because, with great power comes great responsibility, right?
Yeah, like sometimes it's nice to just be ignorant of that, because then you realize like, oh, I'm responsible for, at least kickstarting this. When you sort of relinquish the need to be in the go all of the time and do set time apart to be a part of the vision, you don't have to go and do all the time, but you do have the responsibility to be intentional. And sometimes, like you said, it is confronting and it's very, very difficult. And as you know, there are a lot of twists and turns in life, and even for you, that led you to be where you are right now. So I'd love for you to share your journey from leaving the marketing industry to dipping your toes into coaching and now being a coach full-time, and the woman that you are today, helping so many people self-actualize in the course of their own lives.
Yeah, it was an interesting journey for me. And I think this is true of so many people, right? We have such possibility, and there's not a set path necessarily. And a lot of career journeys are not linear. We're not really necessarily taught that. Right? We think it's going to be, we check the boxes, we move up the steps. And so for me, and this comes up with my clients a lot too, is like, you get into an identity around your work sometimes, right? And this was the case for me. Like, I had built an identity around the work that I was doing. Before I trained as a coach, I had a consulting practice in communications, and I worked with businesses and individuals on thought leadership. I worked in nonprofit in marketing. I had worked as an associate principal in a consulting and training firm doing kind of thought leadership marketing. And there was a lot of pieces of that really worked for me. Like, I had been trained in those things. I was very good at them. I was very successful. I had an identity around, like, people know me for this work. I was also getting burned out. And I knew there was a couple of roles that I had that I knew the day I stepped into those roles that they were not really for me. But they were the next step on the path, right? They made sense on paper. It's like how I like to say it, but I knew like there was something that wasn't quite a good fit. But I had done that work professionally. I've written professionally my whole life, and I always had something going on the side. So I was very busy a lot, right? And it never really felt overwhelming to me, but I was kind of channeling that not in necessarily the right places. And so what happened for me, I did have a bit of a burnout, and I thought, okay, well, I just need to switch workplaces. That's what I'm going to do. And I did that. And that was really great for a while. Like, I made really clear choices about my values of freedom and creativity and impact are not being met here in this role, but this other role that literally just fell into my lap hits all those things. And it's going to be a great opportunity for me. So then I did that for a while, and I started expanding my entrepreneurial ventures and doing some things on the side and having some community work in my community at the same time, all around this area that I was outgrowing.
Yeah.
And it took me I worked with a really experienced trained coach, and I could start to see that, okay, professionally, I was outgrowing that work. And then I was going through personal upheaval at that time and doing a lot of personal growth work. There was a lot of things changing in my personal life, most of which were out of my control. So there was a lot of personal growth work that needed to happen around how I move forward there. And I made some huge decisions to just close up shop with my job and move cross country and do all of these things and start a business. I was like, okay, let's do what I know, right? I'll start a consulting practice. And I did that. And I also went to coach training because I had kept getting these messages from people that know me really well that this would be a path that I might want to consider doing, right? And so finally I started listening to those nudges. And when I went through training, I just fell in love with everything that they were teaching me, right? All of the pieces started to come together for me. So it was like, oh, it may seem like this is really different work on the surface from what I've done in the past, but really what I found was, here is the work that's going to pull all of my key strengths and values together, right? Being a journalist and a writer made me really good at research, observing, listening, communication, all of those things. I got really good at asking good questions. I'm trained really well to ask good questions. So when coaching is so much about like digging into that stuff, I was like, oh, I'm home. This is all about me, right? This is how I operate. And at the same time, there was that strategy and creativity piece that was coming out of my marketing roles, my personal growth that I had done. And I had been a mindfulness practitioner since I was 19, like just really working on my own practice and study. And all of those things kind of fell into coaching, along with my personal interests in how the brain works and psychology and all of those things, and how we can create possibility for ourselves and co-create our reality. All of that's really a personal interest to me. So I just started pulling all the pieces together and started my coaching practice. And I've been doing coaching ever since. But that identity little piece, comes back. And I was really hesitant to give up my identity in the work that I had done previously. So for several years, I did both.
Okay.
And decided that at some point that became unsustainable. Right? I'm not going to run two completely different businesses. That's, for me, not the vision I have for how I want to operate. So then I just, sort of let one go and move more into the other. But for a little bit of time, it was like that struggle of, what is, like, I've moved into this new identity, but I also have this other professional identity, and like really doing the work around what is my vision for how I want to be in the future, and are they both coming with me or not? And for a while the answer was yes, and then it was no.
I think, you hit on so many important points, but I think leaving our identity, and not even our identity, like our ego or what we have perceived to be who we are based on trainings and the labels that we've given ourselves, whether they be job titles and what others have given us accolades for, whether that comes in the form of compliments or revenue that's been working out for you. It can be hard to leave that behind, because in so many ways, who we think we are is so intertwined with what we do. Like, we get into this mindset of like human doing instead of human being. So what were some of the thoughts and feelings that went through your mind when you were finally at the point where you're like, it's time for me to dive, full force into coaching and let some of these other responsibilities like the marketing go? And how did you navigate through that? Because that's, I think, a hard part for a lot of people. But we're all faced with that if we're going to actually pursue our purpose rather than pursue our potential, which is all the things that we're good at and could do.
Yes, it's true. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with having multiple pursuits. I think some people really thrive in that. I know for me, a lot of my life, I did need to have a lot of things going on. It really felt like that fueled me in some ways. But so for me, part of that was like recognizing the shift in myself, like that isn't fueling me anymore.
Mm.
Having multiple things going on is actually not how I want to live going forward, right? I want to be more focused.
Mhm.
So that was a very personal decision for me, knowing how I work best.
Mhm.
But I think the other piece of it, it is that possibility and potential before it's completely, before we've made that shift, it can seem a little bit scary, right?
Yeah.
To give up the things that work that we just maybe are done with. Right? I mean, I've done this with a number of things over the years, and I think everybody does that. There comes a time when it's complete. And then there's something else that's coming down the road, and you're trying to figure out how ideally that's going to look. Maybe you're in it, like in my case, I was in it and doing it. And I was like, how do I want it to look in the future? Like, what am I going to expand here? What am I going to take out? And so there's that theoretical piece of it. And like really just, again, coming back to like, what is that self-trust? What is it that you know you want to do? But the other piece of it is that practical piece. Like maybe there's revenue that's coming in. Maybe there's just a real kind of psychological attachment to what you had been doing before, or what, what you've gotten from that. Like, and that doesn't need to necessarily even be in a career. I mean, this happens all the time, even with just redoing your daily routine. Like I have clients who I suggest, they tell me, okay, this, and this aren't working. And then we come up with a plan of what they might do instead. And like really shifting into that plan, it's a process. It's not like I'm going to wake up tomorrow and say, okay, from now on, this is the new reality, right? It's putting those little pieces into place and moving it forward piece by piece, I think is really the secret to doing that. Like finding what's step one, what's step two, and then when you're in it, step 3, 4, and 5, they all start to show up.
Yeah, that's huge, because a lot of times we want to know what everything's going to look like before we start.
Yes.
It's just knowing that first couple of steps. I forget where I think it was on The Secret that I heard this quote, which is when you're driving down a road at night with your headlights on, you really can only see a couple meters in front of you. But as you keep driving, the rest of the path is illuminated before you. And so that's just such a great analogy for life. And, whether it's from the personal changes that you've been able to make for yourself or help your clients do, you are truly an expert in change, especially with the framework that you've built out, the sustainable success model. So can you break down part of that for us, and how do we effectively make a change, and like what do some of those steps, or what can we expect along the process?
Oh, there's so much to expect because I think change just brings up all the things, right? And change can be really fun. It's an opportunity, but can also be scary as well. And I think it just brings up a lot of things that we'd rather not confront sometimes. It can bring up all of our inner saboteurs, and all of those things might show up to say hello. Like, you don't want to do that. Come over here and do the thing that you were doing before. That works better. And so that's why I am a big fan of the vision married to breaking it down to the small steps. And the vision piece is really coaching research. And there's actually some really great research around coaching and the brain that shows when we have that bigger picture vision, like, and we don't even know we don't need to know how we're going to get there. But if we can have that vision, that it actually activates parts of the brain that allow you to be in a more positive state, to be in a more resourceful state, where you can start then making those actions happen more effectively. Whereas what we often do instead is we set like performance goals, and then those goals kind of can trigger, they don't always, but they can trigger kind of a stress state in our brains. And that makes us hold back a little bit. and causes some of that resistance and procrastination, some negative kind of emotional states. So that's why I like to have the positive vision as the kind of starting point. And then when you break it down, like this, you could do the smallest little increments of forward movement can really short circuit some of the stories that we tell ourselves around what the change is going to be like. So for example, like say if you're doing a career change, right, you can have this vision of how you want to be experiencing your career. You might not know what that career is. So then you start breaking it down and doing the exploration, right? You don't just start throwing applications into anything that sounds good, right? You start thinking about what would work that would get me closer to my vision. And then you're like, the incremental tiniest little step might be like, first I'm going to journal about this. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to think about it, right? Or I'm going to look up something about a particular area that I'm interested in going. Same thing with starting a business. Like you might want to do that exploration work first. And then when you're in a goal, like say you've set some really serious goals for yourself, those goals can be broken down into the tiniest little increments, right? There's some behavioral science around this in terms of habits, which is I like to use in all of the work that I do, that it can be the smallest little increment. So if you're going to change, say, your daily routine so that you're taking more breaks and you're not burning yourself out, right? It might be a 2-minute break. Right? It might be that I step away from the computer for 2 minutes and I just let that settle. Or if I'm kind of starting to do more movement in my life, right? I might work out for 5 minutes and just sort of build those muscles up. And this is, you can use this philosophy, even though it's, it's very habit-based. I think it applies to everything, right? Everything can be broken down into a small little piece, and every one of those small pieces moves you forward. And where I get pushback sometimes when I talk to clients about this is like, small steps is going to take me a really long time. And I want to go fast. Right. And I always say, well, if you want to go fast, you need to still take the small steps, right? Because a couple of small steps might then you're ready for the big leap, right? But if you have to build those muscles of taking the small steps before you are fully in it.
Yeah, and I think it's those small steps that gear us to be able to sustain the success that we have. Like, sure, there are instances of overnight success. I won't say that there isn't, but sustaining that, it takes those small intentional steps that you've just mentioned and the overarching vision to really sustain that. And the vision piece is so important because I think a lot of times along the journey to success, we find ourselves doing really well in a lot of different areas. But what good is the ladder that you've climbed if you put it against the wrong wall? So like understanding like exactly what it is that you want and taking intentional movements to make sure that like it's not just a goal that I'm trying to reach. I'm really going to it from the aspect of like, this is how I would like for my life to look. And how does this thing, this achievement, if you will, fit into the framework of our lives? And when we're talking about that, I think there's, we know what we want out of life. We know what we want to do, but we can be complacent at times. So it's one thing to be motivated to make a change, but another entirely to know that you want to make a change, what you need, but also be like, I'm pretty comfortable and I'm complacent with where I am. So how do we move from complacency to action, or from comfort to action to get to where we want to be?
Yeah, it's so funny too, because, there's always this discussion about, and I talk about this a lot, so I'm equally guilty of this, but, that there is that need to stretch your edges and be on the other side of discomfort to make progress, right? And this is true and not true at the same time. To me, I'm not a big fan of jumping out of your comfort zone because I think it can trigger a lot of stress reaction that is embedded in our brains that, is happening on a subconscious level. And so sometimes that backfires. Sometimes it works. But what always works is understanding that we don't need to do everything at once, right? We don't need to push ourselves that hard. What we can do is we can walk on the edge. We can stretch our comfort zone a little bit more until it's stretched a little bit more and a little bit more, right? That is generally a more productive and effective way of working, I find. But I think the other piece of it is sometimes comfort is good, right? Sometimes we're not ready to make the move, and that's why that comfort keeps coming to the fore. We may not be willing to jump out of something to do something different right now. And I think that we need to be careful as we're in that space to not be making judgments about one being better than the other, because sometimes there are real reasons that we need to take care of before we can make the next move, right? We may need to set up some practical structures to take care of ourselves financially if we're making a financially impactful change. There might be work that we need to do internally to be feeling like we're comfortable with making a specific kind of change, right? There's all sorts of factors. But then when you know it's time, like we know, right? Like often there'll be a point where we're like, okay, well, we know that it's time. And that resistance can come up. And that's where those little steps can come in, right? Like what's the smallest little thing that you could do to move that forward? And then you do that a few times, then connecting to those values and vision, because this is why I like vision, because it really connects you to your values. And so there comes a moment where you're in connection with that values and vision, and you know that where you are isn't helping you get there, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that can be the motivating tip for a lot of people, right? It's when if they can keep coming back to those things that are important to them, it becomes very clear when the change needs to happen.
Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons it's so important to be in touch with ourselves and why we need a mindfulness practice, because we're told to, make the leap of faith. And I think it's important to, right? Like,
yeah, sometimes it is.
Steps to confirm what that leap is, or sometimes we're acting out of the heat of passion. Mm-hmm. And for something really inspirational that kind of resonated with what we're going through, but maybe haven't done our due diligence. And I think that it's important to, even if we don't have all of the answers in front of us, listen to that gut reaction. There's a real reason why we have our intuition, or why, sometimes our bodies react to certain stimuli or circumstances or options that we have before us. Our body, we have a very visceral and somatic response to that. And to tune in to when we feel excited, when we feel a little worried, and what those things are, to get a better picture of where we need to focus our attention before we go and make huge leaps. Because I think it's wonderful to go out and just go after what you want, but we want to do that from a perspective of being informed. And once we're informed, once we've built that ground foundation of confidence in the thing that we know we're supposed to do, then we can take guided actions. But it's really hard to do that when we just kind of hear something, we're like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going off it,
yes,
research, and then we're flailing trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I think that it's so important to have that connection to ourselves. And I think so many of us live up in our heads. You're right. The body is always responding, and we're just not always paying attention to what those responses are. And it can be very easy to get caught up in so much that goes on. I mean, we live in a really noisy world. And so if we're not connecting to ourselves and really learning how to read those body cues and trust them, and trust that maybe we need to sit with something and really feel how we feel about it, versus jumping into, and I think this happens a lot, especially in the business world, right? I mean, we see what everybody else is doing. That sounds great. Let's go do that. Or I should be doing that. So let's, add this to my plate. But really, those things might not all be for us. So it's really kind of connecting into what is for you, and making those decisions from a really grounded place. It really requires that self-knowledge. And, we can't trust ourselves immediately. We have to learn how to do that. by listening and by being mindful and by just kind of experimenting, right? So we don't want to jump off the cliff until we have a little bit more information about what is for us, right?
And I think one of the reasons that's so important is also because sometimes, oftentimes that visceral response is there to serve as a cue or a warning, but other times it can be a trauma response to past situations. And a lot of times too, we'll see that the way that we're feeling and the feelings of discomfort can be a result of imposter syndrome or feelings of self-doubt. And that's very different from the need to like do more research and be informed. So when we've uncovered that what we're feeling isn't due to the fact that we don't have the resources or aren't in a position to act on that thing, but are instead our issues of our mind, our imposter syndrome, if you will, how do we actually overcome those feelings?
Yeah, and it does bring up those feelings almost all the time. And I think this is one of the most powerful things that we can do to counteract that is remember that, right? If we're in the middle of changing something, that piece of being new at it, being uncomfortable with it, like those are real feelings. And I think if we're being honest, pretty much every human has experienced that at some time. I do think the research shows that women kind of tend to have more of that than men, but men have it too. And we've all experienced some of that at some point where there's part of the learning where we're just not competent at the new skills, whether those are personal skill, growth skills, or an actual skill in the world. We might have new expectations that we're not comfortable with, or new environments that we're not sure how to operate in. So for me, I have a lot of feelings about how we talk about imposter syndrome, because I think it's a very human condition. It's not necessarily a syndrome, but there's so many ways we can work with it. And I think it is very important, as you say, to really think about why it's coming up and recognizing when it is that versus something else, right? Because then we can kind of understand how to quiet it down a little bit more, right? I think of it more as like it's our inner saboteur voice that's saying, wait a minute, and we all have a little bit of a different voice, but it might be saying, you're not enough yet to do this, right? You need more qualifications. You need more of this. You need more of that. It might be saying something from an old trauma response that's, you don't belong in that environment, right? There's a lot of different ways in which it shows up. And so really understanding that that's what it is, then you can talk back to it a little bit more, right? Like for me, the most important thing is to label it like, oh, that's what that is. And then getting comfortable with recognizing it when it's showing up. And then we can start to separate ourselves from it. Because I think where we get mixed up in it a lot is that we start to think of it as us, right? It's part of us. It's not. It's like, if we can create that separation, like that's just that imposter voice talking to me. I don't have to listen to that right now. And I know one of my favorite things to do is to just like give it a name, give it some character so that you can really embed that separation in your mind. Like I have a client who he calls his Leonard, and he sends it away. And then I have another client who sends her imposter voice on a 2-week vacation whenever it gets kind of antsy. She's like, I just keep imagining my imposter. I don't have to listen to her because, she's in Hawaii right now.
I love that. And I think it's really cool to give it an actual name. Like when you said that, I thought of there's a TV show, it has like a 90s TV show, Sister, and they would say, go home, Roger. So that's kind of how I think I may name mine Roger.
I think it's really helpful. I mean, it in some ways is a bit of a silly practice, but I think that's part of its power, is it kind of defangs the whole imposter issue, right? If we can just give it a little bit of lightness and a little bit of separation, and remember that just because that voice keeps coming up doesn't mean we need to listen to it.
Yeah, doesn't mean we need to listen to it, but even more importantly, what you said is that thought is not us. And that's not necessarily our belief about ourselves. And it's certainly not our truth. And so once we're able to other that, and I'm definitely naming mine Roger now, and once we're able to identify when Roger comes around, we can send him home. Along that same vein, because I think that's a really incredible self-care practice for preserving your mind, preserving your peace. What other things can we do on a daily basis just to be better stewards of our own self-care?
I think we've mentioned some really critical ones that I always kind of bring back is mindfulness. To me is really important, and it doesn't need to be meditation. It can be just like paying attention to our senses for 5 minutes, what we're hearing and thinking, and just kind of being in the present moment. It can mean paying attention on a walk without any sort of earbuds in or noise around you. It can be just paying attention to washing the dishes if that's something that you need to get done. So the mindfulness piece is important, I think, also because it helps us build interoception and exteroception so we can be more in our body, so we know what's going on in our body. So that's one piece that's really easy to practice. We're never going to get mastery over that, but I think it's a wonderful practice, and we can build on it. We can become more embodied. We can become more mindful, and that helps us tune in to knowing what we need. So that's the other thing I like to really bless with my clients is taking those times. You can do this every day, or whenever anything is kind of coming up for you, or even just as a morning practice. It's like, what do I need right now? Like just taking those little pauses and asking yourself to build those self-trust muscles. And I think self-trust is such a big part of self-care. So that's one thing. Also rest. I mean, I think rest is really undervalued as a resource.
Yeah.
Right? The more we rest, the better we feel. And it doesn't mean that we need to rest forever, but just taking those little pockets of rest. I know some people are really uncomfortable with just slowing down. It can be incredibly powerful to take rest. The other thing that I really like is embodiment as a mantra, movement, mindset kind of practice. So thinking about what's a quality that I want to embody that's important to the work that I'm doing right now, or how I want to show up with my family, or whatever the case may be. Like thinking about something that's really important to you to cultivate, and then creating a very simple 1 or 2, 3 word mantra around that, and then creating a movement to go with it. So like say boundaries is something that is really important to you right now, is learning, like I'm going to say no to some things, right? So thinking about that in terms of no, right? And having that, like, just, it creates more of an embodied practice that helps you establish those patterns, both in your body and your minds, to marry them together. So that's another self-care practice that costs nothing, but is really powerful. Mm-hmm. And then the other piece of it, I think, is worthiness is another piece that comes up, like thinking about where is your worthiness at on any given day, right? And how are you reinforcing that to yourself? Like, what is it? And that can be part of like, what do I need right now? But the other piece of that is, what do I want right now, right? And really just allowing yourself to have what you want really builds those worthiness muscles as well, I think. Is coming back to that, like, what do I want right now? Because we don't ask ourselves that nearly enough, right?
No, we don't. And sometimes we'll get around to, what do I need? But what do I want? What do I really, truly want? And then feeling that we're worthy of that thing. I think a lot of times that's the pillar of confidence that's a bit harder to get to. So I really appreciate that you brought that up. And you've given us so many gems today. But before I let you go, I just want to know, are there any final words of wisdom that you'd like to share?
Let's see. My one of the things I like to remember for myself that I would share is that it's always a great time to reinvent parts of your life that aren't working.
I love that. That's good. It's always a great time to reinvent parts of your life that aren't working.
Yes.
Well,
because
yeah.
we can say that we don't have time to do it. It's always a great time to give yourself more of what works.
Mhm. That's another one. It's always a great time to give. Yeah, it is always a great time. And this conversation definitely worked. So thank you so much for joining me for Confidence Conversations. It was such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. I have so much enjoyed this conversation. It's been great talking with you, and I appreciate the space and the conversation.